dear friends and net aspirants, welcome back to High Point again, where you can get immense amount of study materials related to NTA, UGC, NET, JRF, English Language and Literature. So as you can see, today's topic is Preface to Lyrical Ballads. So this is one of the most eminent essays that we can find in every other paper of literary theory and criticism that we can find in MA classes. Okay, so Preface to Lyrical Ballads is very important. See, Lyrical Ballads is a collection of poetry written by Wordsworth and Coleridge, and Wordsworth actually added a preface to its second edition, which came out in 1800 in order to justify their poetry and its composition and the language that they have used inside that poetry. So without further delay, if you are interested and we are ready with a paper and pen, let's move on to the main video. Before that, let me tell you about the Instagram ID that I have. If you are also there in Instagram, you can follow me there, where I am sharing a lot of free materials, and also as a new item we have introduced a Monday morning quiz in which we are sharing quiz questions, 10 to 15 questions about a same subject, a particular text or a particular thing related to literature. So if you want to have that, you can follow me in Instagram, and my ID is right here. And I also have a WhatsApp group in which I am sharing news and updates related to NTA, UGC, NET, as well as some study materials, also daily quiz question and answer too. So if you want to join, you can go to the description box and click the link and join the WhatsApp group, or if not, you can message me directly. I'll be glad to make you admit there. And also we have a website known as www.highpoint.in, in which we are sharing 900 plus audio lectures and 300 plus PDF downloadable materials under 10 different subjects. And you know, all this combined, you have sufficient materials for your NTA, UGC, NET, JRF preparations, which are systematically arranged, comprehensible and simplified study materials. Okay, so you can go to the website using the link given in the description box, or through Chrome too. You can go by typing www.highpoint.in, and you can have the free trial and see the demo materials and have the 15% off that we have offered there for you to join us for now. And once you have this offer, you can grab it, and if you have joined either of the courses, you will get 2 bonuses. What are they? Weekly tests related to English language and literature, different subjects, priorly already announced it. Once you have joined it, we will give that list to you. You can prepare according to it, and you can practice question papers related to a subject, a particular subject, and also you will get a personalized study guidelines according to your schedules and your preferences of topic. So moving on, if you are interested, let me know through the WhatsApp number that I have given here, or you can call me in that number as well. Let's have an introduction about Lyrical Ballad, which published in 1798, and which is actually a collection of poetry by William Wordsworth and Coleridge. See, I'm not going to explain all those things because I assume that you all know that. The publication of Lyrical Ballads actually marked the beginning of romanticism or romantic movement in England, and end of neoclassicism or neoclassical period, okay, in 1798. And the second edition for this Lyrical Ballads, this collection of poetry, came out in 1800, and a preface was added to this second edition by William Wordsworth. So in the first edition there were no preface and all, simply it was just a collection. So Lyrical Ballad consisted of 23 poems, 4 by Coleridge and the rest by Wordsworth. And Lyrical Ballads declare the dawn of the English romantic movement. Just now I said this point, that with the Lyrical Ballads, romantic movement or romantic period in England started, and it actually breaking away from the neoclassical tendencies of poetry. And Coleridge and Wordsworth set out a different kind of theory of poet and a different kind of theory of poets and poetical language. Everything related to poetry was different for them. In 1802, the third edition came out with an appendix. So an appendix was added to the third edition of the work, Lyrical Ballads, which came out in 1802. Please note down these points, guys. And Lyrical Ballads got 3 parts. See, in Lyrical Ballads, it is actually a pretty much a lengthy essay So I'm not going to discuss each and every kind of things that are there in the preface, but what is more important from net point of view and JRF point of view, we'll discuss that. So let me tell you, the preface is divided into three major parts. So in the first part we can see subject matter, theme, language, style of writing a poetry. In the second part we can see functions of poets, superiority of poetry over other branches of knowledge, pleasure and truth of poetry. And in third part we can see, and in the third part again he is discussing about the language of poetry, meter, the different stages of creative process, Wordsworth reply to critics in defense of his poem. So these things we can see in the third part. So let's begin. So if you are writing down notes, then that is great. That is a great thing that you are doing in order to memorize the points more. Simply listening won't help you, let me tell you straight. See, if you want to have an elaborate, detailed, well arranged kind of each and every point that is there in the three parts, you want that kind of a discussion, a lesson, then you can directly go to my website and have the free trial and see what we have provided there. And if you are interested, you can join us today itself, and don't waste your time by waiting for the next NTA UGC NET exam schedule or notification, because you will run out of time. You will need plenty of times in order to cover all these portions and come back to the portions that you have already learned using different tools. So let me help you in this regard if you are interested. Okay, let's first of all move on to the first part. Let's see one by one what all things Wordsworth is saying in the preface of the first part. First thing he says about the simple and rustic subject matter for poetry and simple and rustic language for poetry. So what comes under simple and rustic? Rustic means not that urbanized, which is in its original form. Okay, simple and rustic subject matter for poetry, under which he says that humble and ordinary themes. So he talks about humble and ordinary themes, incidents and situations from common life, the language of common people, as common people are more near to nature and their language is away from any kind of vanities. So he mainly talks about what kind of subject matter we need to take for poetic composition. So he says that you need to take humble and ordinary themes, which are incidents and situations from common life, common people's life. That means these common people, they are living in relation, in near or in communion with nature. So the language that they are using also more suitable, and they are away from any kind of artificiality or any kind of urbanized vanities. So their language, it contains a kind of purity, a kind of naturalness in order to create a more spontaneous kind of poetry. So that is his major argument about matter of poetry. So if you compare this with neoclassical poetry, there was the notion that poetry need to be composed about elevated subjects, and common and humble ordinary themes are not suitable for literary composition, especially poetry. So that was the assumption there, but it was completely objected, and Wordsworth actually dismantles this idea and tells that humble ordinary themes described in humble language or rustic language, that is the most suitable subject matter and language for poetry. In the next point, he makes the same thing, simple and rustic language of poetry. So once you are determined to use humble and ordinary themes from the incidents and situations from common life, then what is the most suitable language for you to compose this poetry? It is the language of the rustic people, or those who are living in communion and near to nature, far away from any other urban vanities. Okay, so you cannot use their language as it is, but you have to use a purified version of rustic language, which must be used in poetry. In a purified version means, the rustic language will contain many colloquial expressions and colloquial things. You have to purify the language from all this colloquialism, and you can use that rustic language in order to compose more spontaneous poetry. The rustic language arises out of repeated experience and regular feelings, and therefore it is simple and has got clarity of expression. So why Wordsworth is emphasizing upon the use of simple language or rustic language? Because it is away from any kind of artificiality. It got more clarity of expression because it arised out of repeated experiences and regular feelings. So therefore it is simple and has got clarity of expression, and it is free from artificial poetic diction of earlier poets. So it is also away from any kind of artificiality. So that's why he is emphasizing the use of rustic subject matter as well as rustic language in poetry. Next thing that he says in part 1 is thought and feelings in poetry. So he says that a good poem has definiteness of purpose, and it should enlighten the readers with new ideas and purify their feelings. So he says that, a good poetry should actually it will have a definiteness of purpose. So it will have a well defined purpose. What is that purpose? It will enlighten the readers with new ideas and purify their feelings. And all good poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions recollected in tranquility. So this is a famous quotation that Shakespeare gives in his preface about poetry. So he identifies poetry as a spontaneous flow. It is very natural flow of powerful emotions whenever we recollect the emotions that we once experienced by seeing and by having an experience, and that emotions are recollected in tranquility, means recollected when we are actually sitting with a calm of mind. Okay, a poet is a man who is possessed of more than usual organic sensibility. And also, along with the defining poetry, he also defines who is a poet. So poet is not a person who is actually residing in some towers. A poet is a man who is actually possessed with, or whose capacity is that he is having an unusual organic sensibility to understand things and see through things. So even though poet is not himself or herself is experiencing certain thing, but since poets have a kind of unusual or a kind of more than usual organic sensibility, they can understand things, what is going on inside that person, or what is the experience of this thing. They have an kind of unusual kind of imagination in order to understand things. The next thing that he says about the inferior emotional excitement. So usually the city people or urban people, their mundane, their usual and their monotonous life of city creates boredom in people. See, usually the city people, those people are living quite away from nature. They are having a mundane, very common kind of, or a monotonous kind of life in city, and this will create a boredom in people, and this boredom will turn them to enjoy inferior kind of literature that they can find in journals, magazines and all, and their taste will get degraded after enjoying this inferior kind of literature, and it will also mislead them. So he aims at refining the taste of the readers using noble and dignified subject matters in his poetry. So he says that as a poet, Wordsworth aims at refining the taste of the readers that already have lowered because of reading inferior literature, using noble and dignified subject matter in his poetry. See, the common people, the common readers, they have lost the taste for literature, especially for poetry. Why? Because poets were composing poetry in a high ranked, using high ranked dictions, and in a very pompous way they were writing poetry so far in neoclassical age, as well as about higher level of themes. Okay, so this was actually not digestible to the common people, so they will turn their in order to get rid of their boredom, they will turn to inferior kind of literature. This will mislead them and lower their taste. So as a poet, or he says that the aim of any poet must be refine the taste of the readers using noble and dignified subject matter which are more suitable to poetry. Okay, moving on, again in the first part itself he says that he says about style of language in lyrical ballads. So he talked about the subject matter, language, and now he talks about the style of language. Since personification is not natural or regular trait of English language, personification of abstract ideas is avoided. So he mainly talks about the style of language that he has used in his poetry that are there in lyrical ballads. Okay, so he says that in his poetry and also in Coleridge's poetry, personification as a figure of speech is avoided because it is not natural and also it is not a regular trait of English language. So personification of abstract ideas is avoided, and poetic diction, as said by neoclassics, is also avoided. That in neoclassicism we can see that poetry was composed through careful selection of dictions. See, diction was given more important than even the subject matter or style of language. See, so you have to use very elevated kind of diction while creating poetry about an elevated subject matter. So that was completely rejected by Wordsworth, and he used simple and rustic diction which are suitable for the humble and simple themes that he has produced through his poetry. The style of the poetry is natural and appropriates to the subject matter. So the style that he has chosen to write the poetry is so natural because he is anyway telling about humble and rustic subject matters and in a rustic language. So the style should be suitable and appropriate and more natural to the subject matter that he has already used in his poetry. The next theme that next thing that he is discussing in his first part is that essential difference between prose and poetry. So is there any essential difference between or basic difference between prose and poetry, the language that we are used in prose and poetry? This is a quotation from the work. There neither is nor can be any essential difference between the language of prose and metrical composition. That means the language of prose and language of verse or poetry both are same. The only difference is that the employment of meter in poetry. So we use different kind of meters in poetry. Other than that, there is no difference is possible or can be between the language of prose and poetry. Next point that he makes in the first part of the preface is the evolution of language in poetry. So he says that language is actually used by people to communicate. So we have to use that natural language in poetry too. A poet must be judged based on how he exploits language and expresses the passions and feelings appropriately. So when you see the poem and when you are going to judge that poet after reading that poetry, you have to judge that poet not because that he has composed a poetry about an inferior subject according to you. So you have to judge a poet on the basis that how he exploited this language and how he is expressed the passion and feeling more appropriately and suitably. So these are the major themes that we can find in part 1 of preface. Now let's move on to the part 2 of the preface. Now the part 2 begins with the functions of a poet. So some points that he already made in the first part itself about the functions of poet, but he elaborates on the functions of poet and the definition of the poet here in this session as well. First of all, he defines a poet. A poet is a man speaking to men who is endowed with more lively sensibility. See, already he has made this point that a poet is a man who is speaking to man, not a man who is residing in his far away tower and speaking to men, but he is a man like every other common man, but speaking to several other men, and also he is endowed, he is gifted with a more lively sensibility that he could understand a situation even though he is not experiencing that situation, and the one has a more comprehensible soul and intensive imaginative power. So these are characteristics of a good poet who is endowed with more lively sensibility, who is a man speaking to men, and he has more comprehensible soul, understandable soul, and intense imaginative power. Okay, so these are the major traits of being a poet. Again, he talks about pleasure and truth in poetry. What kind of truth we can find in poetry? And poetry represents truth akin to nature. So poetry should represent truth, a kind of facts that are quite near and quite relatable to nature, a kind of universal truth that Wordsworth means here. So it's not that absolute truth that we can find in poetry, but a kind of universal truth. Through particular characters and situations, a poet will present truth akin to nature in poetry, and it is not a dry or grim representation of truth, but it will provide pleasure to the reader. So in a pleasing manner, this universal truth need to be presented to the readers. And another point that he makes in part second is that poetry superior to all branches of knowledge. So he justify the branch poetry as a branch of knowledge which is superior to any other discipline. So again in this section he defines a poet. He defines a poet as a translator, as he presents the truth, adding more beauty into it. So it's not that what is there in nature as truth, he is directly rendering that truth and telling to the readers, but he is adding more beauty and translating that truth to in such a way that this, after reading this, the readers will get pleased. So the poet is like a translator. And poetic truth is universal, where we can see both particular and general truth provided. So poetry is more superior in many sense. So he says that it adds beauty to what it says. Poetic truth is a kind of elevated kind of truth which is universal. It is not absolute truth, but it is a universal kind of truth where we can see both particular as well as general truth in it. Now let's move on to the part 3 of Preface. Here he actually mainly talks about two things: the 4 phases of poetic creation and Wordsworth's defense of his poems, as critics actually showered many criticism upon his new kind of poetry. Okay, not only Wordsworth but Coleridge's too. So now first of all let's see what are the 4 phases of poetic creation. Here I have listed them. First one is observation, second is recollection, third one is recrudescence, then fourth one is actual writing of the poetry. So first one is observation. Observation means you are observing things, events, people, and the general phenomena going around you. As a poet, you are observing them. Poet is a one who has an unusual sensibility, who has very great imaginative power and all. So using that, you are observing them, and it's like you are having experiences of various kinds, and you are not having a simple kind of experiences, but you will arrive at greater kind of meanings out of that experiences. And the second stage is recollection. So after those experiences in another situation, you will recollect that thing, whatever you have already observed and experienced. The third one is recrudescence, the outbreak of emotion registered in poet's mind already. See, when you were really originally experiencing and observing the phenomena or the people or the events or the general emotions there, you must had some emotions, right? That emotion will come again and that emotion will break out. That is already registered, already happened, already known to the poet's mind. Okay, that is recrudescence, and that is the third phase of poetic creation. The fourth phase of poetic creation is the actual writing of the poetry. See, if you remember the definition given to poetry by Wordsworth is that poetry is a continuous overflow of emotion. So recrudescence is continuous overflow of emotion that we recollect in tranquility. So that we recollect when we when we sit to write a poetry, we will recollect that emotions that we have already there in our mind by observing, by having that experience earlier. Okay, so the fourth phase is the actual writing of poetry. So I hope you have noted down these 4 phases of poetic creation. Questions can be asked. The next thing that he says in part 3 is Wordsworth, the defense of his poem. So there were many criticism going on his new kind of, not only Wordsworth's but Coleridge's, both of their new kind of poetry, which were quite unusual for the neoclassical critics and neoclassical readers. Okay, this kind of poetry was not suitable to, this kind of poetical creations were not familiar to their literary taste. So there were many criticism rising against their poetry. So one of the major aim that was there in writing this preface by Wordsworth is that to defend their poetry against all this criticism, and that defense that he has done in the part 3 of Preface to Lyrical Ballads. The first allegation was that he has used subject, he means Wordsworth has used subject which are not worthy of presentation in poetry. See, in a classical age, I have already told you this thing, that in a classical age they have a category of worthy subject matters. Like elevated subject matters only are worthy to write a poetry. So they assumed that the common subject matters, the themes related to common people and rustic people, these are not worthy to write a poetry. So he used such humble subject matters, rustic subject matter, in order to write poetry. So that was the first allegation raised against Wordsworth's poetry, and he justifies his use of humble subject matter by saying that the worth of a subject matter depends upon not on its nature but on its right and effective treatment. So you are just looking at the subject matter and you are saying that these poetries are useless, but it should not be like that. That he says that the worth, the use value of a subject matter does not depend upon its nature. Now, what kind of subject matter is not that important, but how this subject matter got treated effectively and in a rightful manner, that is more important when you analyze a subject matter. Not the nature of subject matter is important. So that is the explanation that gives that Wordsworth gives for first allegation. The second allegation is that he has used particular words and phrases for an expression in his poems. So he has actually used particular words and phrases. That means that he has used common words and common diction in his poetry. That means humble and rustic language is used in his poem. He rejected it and says that what is prime important in poetry is feeling, and language comes next to feeling. So in neoclassical scenario, you can see that selection of proper diction was given more important than feeling, subject matter or any other language. You have to use a proper set of dictions in order to create poetry. That was so essential. Wordsworth actually broke all these assumptions, and he used particular words and phrases of common and rustic language in his poems. So he says that this is irrelevant. This allegation is irrelevant because as far as poetry is concerned, what is more important, what is of prime important, because it is feelings. In a poetry, feelings are of prime importance, not language. Even language comes next to feelings. Okay, so this was the justification and explanation and defense that he makes against the second allegation raised against his poetry. So that's all about it. Please remember the important points that he has made about poetic language, subject matter, and style of language and dictions, and also he has talked about the definition of poetry, poets, and the aim of poetry. In the third part, we have seen the defenses that he gives about the allegation raised against his poetry, as well as 4 phases of poetic creation or artistic creation of poetry. Please remember all these important points, and I hope you have made enough sufficient materials, notes for yourself after hearing this audio. If you have any more doubts and if you want any more explanations, I'll be glad to provide that. Please mention all of them in the comment section, or you can directly message me in here in this WhatsApp number, or call me and ask me. I will explain everything to you, and I have provided my Instagram ID here. If you are also present in the platform of Instagram, you can follow me there, because there I'm sharing lot of study materials, free study materials that you can save to your account, and you can have daily quizzes, reels related to literature, as well as study cards too. And most importantly, you can visit my website if you are looking for some systematically arranged, comprehensible, simplified study materials in the form of audio lectures and PDF materials and practice and previous question papers. Then you can visit my website www.highpoint.in and also see what we have provided there after having the free trial. Then if you are interested, you can join us, because a 15% of off is going on. Don't miss this chance to join us and learn, and after joining you will get many more things. The two bonuses that are sure that you will get is that weekly test in every Saturdays, and also personalized study guidelines. And also, if you want to join the WhatsApp group that I mentioned there, go to the description box and click the link and join, or message me in this number. I will share the link and you can join. So that's all about it. And if you have not yet subscribed to my channel, subscribe to it and also press the bell icon so that you should not miss any of the uploadings that we are making in this channel. So thank you for listening to this video so far. I really appreciate your support that you are giving to me by listening to and subscribing to my channel. So that's all about it. Meet you in the next video session. Until then, bye bye. Thank you.